There was once a powder so simple, so cheap, and so effective that it helped keep food dry for months without plastic seals, vacuum machines, or modern packaging. And almost nobody talks about it now. Because we have been trained to believe that long-term food protection must come from factories, branded containers, synthetic barriers, and industrial preservation systems too advanced for ordinary people to reproduce. But that belief hides an older truth. For generations, people used natural mineral and plant-based powders to control moisture, slow spoilage, and protect stored grain-dried food and fragile ingredients from the invisible enemy that ruins them first: humidity. That sounds too simple, and that is exactly why it is so easy to dismiss. If a forgotten powder could help preserve food with almost no technology, then an uncomfortable question appears. Why did modern life replace such a cheap solution with layers of disposable packaging? Because the powder did not disappear by accident. Most people think food spoils because time passes, but time is only part of the story. The real destroyer is often moisture, not the dramatic kind you can see. The invisible kind hiding in air, trapped inside containers, creeping slowly into grains, salt, spices, dried roots, powdered foods, and preserved ingredients until texture changes, clumps form, mold awakens, and shelf life begins to collapse from the inside. That is the part modern consumers rarely think about. We are surrounded by packaging, so we assume packaging is protection. Plastic bags, foil layers, vacuum seals, oxygen absorbers, silica packets, tight lids, branded storage systems. These all make preservation feel like a modern engineering achievement. And in many ways they are. But that creates a strange blind spot. What did people do before all of that? How did merchants move dry goods across humid regions? How did households store grain through changing seasons? How did communities protect powdered food, herbs, seeds, and salt in places where damp air could ruin survival itself? The answer is uncomfortable in its simplicity. In many older systems, storage was not treated as a battle won only by the container. It was treated as a battle won by controlling the microenvironment around the food, and sometimes that meant using powders, dry, cheap, absorbent, stable materials that could pull moisture away, buffer humidity, or protect stored goods from the slow invasion of dampness. That changes the story. Because once moisture control becomes the real issue, modern packaging starts to look less like the only answer and more like just one answer, an answer that became dominant when industrial supply chains learned how to monetize preservation through disposable materials, branded systems, and recurring consumption. But then something strange happened. The old powders became primitive, the packets became modern, and the knowledge that dryness itself could be managed with almost no technology began to disappear from everyday memory. Long before modern packaging surrounded food with layers of plastic foil seals and branding, people had already learned a harsher truth about survival. Dry food was never truly safe just because it was dry once. It had to stay dry. That lesson shaped storage practices across ancient households, trading cultures, farms, desert settlements, humid river regions, and merchant networks, where food preservation was not about convenience, but continuity. Grain flour, salt, dried herbs, medicinal roots, powdered plants, tea spices, and preserved foods could survive for long periods, but only if moisture was kept away. Once dampness entered the system, the collapse could begin quietly. Texture changed first, then clumping, then fermentation, then insects, then rot mold or total loss. So older societies became experts in dryness, not in the modern industrial sense, in the observational sense. They noticed which rooms stayed safer, which jars failed, which storage pits spoiled faster during wet seasons, which sacks absorbed too much air moisture, which vessels seemed stable on the outside but produced ruined food within. Over generations, this became a practical science of humidity control, even if the people using it never described it with modern chemistry. And within that science, powders played a quiet but important role. In many traditional systems, dry powders were used not as food themselves but as environmental helpers. Certain mineral dusts, ash-based materials, fine clays, chalk-like substances, lime-related compounds in specific contexts, and plant-derived drying powders were sometimes used around storage environments, in layers in separated compartments, in vessel treatments, or as part of preservation systems designed to protect food from moisture migration. The principle was simple. Dryness protects dryness. Ancient grain storage offers one of the clearest examples. Across parts of Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the Mediterranean world communities used elevated storage structures, sealed ceramic vessels, dried plant linings, ash barriers, and absorbent materials to manage the conditions around grain. The goal was not just to store food in a container. The goal was to create a stable internal world where moisture had fewer ways to invade. Ash in particular appeared again and again in traditional preservation. That was not an accident. Fine ash from clean burned plant matter could act as a dry barrier in certain storage practices. It helped separate contents from air exposure, discouraged pests in some cases, and most importantly contributed to a lower moisture environment when used correctly in traditional methods. In some communities, seeds and grains were stored with carefully handled ash layers. In others, dried foods were protected in vessels where powder-like dry materials helped control the microclimate. Then there were clays and mineral dusts. Across trading civilizations, dry mineral materials were valued for their stabilizing role in containers, walls, and storage spaces. A storage room that stayed dry was not just built well. It was often finished, lined, or maintained using materials chosen for their interaction with moisture. Earthen walls, mineral plasters, and desiccating powders all existed inside a broader preservation logic: stop dampness before it reaches what matters. Salt traders understood this. Spice merchants understood this. Tea handlers, herb keepers, and people storing powdered foods understood this. Because once a dry ingredient absorbs too much humidity, it begins to die long before it visibly spoils. Aroma fades, texture collapses, weight changes, clumps form, flavor degrades, insects become more likely. Shelf life shrinks. And for communities depending on stored supplies, these were not minor inconveniences. They were threats. Traditional Asian storage practices also reveal the pattern. In regions with monsoon cycles and brutal seasonal humidity, households learned that the air itself could be the enemy. Grains were sun-dried repeatedly. Containers were aired and reheated. Storage spaces were raised or insulated from wet surfaces. Drying agents, sometimes ash, sometimes mineral materials, sometimes plant powders, were used not as decorative extras, but as part of the preservation system. The same logic appeared in desert societies, though from the opposite direction. There, the challenge was not constant ambient wetness, but controlling the fragility of dried goods as they moved across changing climates. A product stored safely in arid conditions could be ruined when transported into humid air. Powders and dry barrier materials helped create a buffer against that transition. Then commerce expanded, and preservation scaled. As food moved farther, storage technologies became more standardized. Later, industrial packaging transformed the whole field. Cans, sealed paper systems, plastics, laminates, synthetic liners, commercial desiccants, oxygen absorbers, and branded preservation products gradually replaced the older logic of environmental control through simple local materials. The old powders did not stop working. They stopped fitting the new system. Industrial trade wanted uniformity, long-distance reliability, visual cleanliness, regulatory simplicity, and products that could be mass-produced at scale. Traditional powders were often messy, local variable, or dependent on handling knowledge passed from person to person. They belonged to cultures of practice, not cultures of packaging. So the story changed. Preservation became something done by factories, containers became the hero. The powder disappeared into the background, but the core truth remained exactly the same as it had been centuries earlier. Food stays dry when its environment stays dry. And long before modern packets were dropped into branded bags, people had already discovered that powders, cheap, quiet, ordinary powders, could help defend that dryness for months. To understand how an old powder could help keep food dry for months, we need to strip away one common misunderstanding first. Spoilage is not always caused by air alone. Very often it is caused by water hiding inside the air. That hidden water is humidity, and humidity is far more dangerous to stored dry food than most people realize. A product can look perfectly safe from the outside while slowly absorbing microscopic amounts of moisture from the surrounding environment. Over time, that tiny absorption changes everything. Powders begin to clump, grains soften, salt hardens into blocks, dried herbs lose crispness, spices lose volatility. Seeds become vulnerable, mold becomes more likely, insects thrive more easily, and the shelf life people assumed they had begins to disappear. This is where the powder enters the story, not as magic, as moisture management. A dry powder can help preserve food when it changes the microenvironment around the stored material. The exact mechanism depends on the kind of powder being used, but in general the science revolves around 4 ideas: moisture absorption, humidity, buffering surface separation, and environmental stabilization. The first is moisture absorption. Some powders naturally attract and hold water molecules from the air. In modern science, these would be described as desiccating or moisture-absorbing materials. The principle is simple. If the powder captures part of the ambient moisture before that moisture reaches the food, then the food remains drier for longer. Even a small reduction in surrounding humidity can have an outsized effect on shelf life, especially for sensitive dry goods. That is the key. The food does not have to become drier than dry. It only has to avoid getting wetter. The second mechanism is humidity buffering. Not every useful powder aggressively absorbs water. Some help by stabilizing the local environment instead. They reduce fluctuation. In a storage vessel drawer room or layered system, a dry powder can act as a buffer that slows how quickly moisture conditions change. This matters because many forms of spoilage are not triggered by a single dramatic event. They begin when a food is repeatedly exposed to cycles of dampness, slight warming, cooling, and reabsorption. In other words, instability is the enemy. A stable, dry environment is protection. This is why old storage systems often worked better than they appear to modern eyes. People were not always trying to create perfect laboratory dryness. They were trying to create a calmer moisture environment, one where the food was not constantly being attacked by invisible swings in humidity. Powders helped create that calm. The third mechanism is surface separation. Sometimes a powder protects not by changing the air directly, but by physically separating food from a moisture source. This can happen when powder layers reduce direct contact with damp surfaces, create dry barriers inside storage structures, or prevent the contents from sticking together and trapping localized moisture pockets. In traditional systems, powders such as ash or fine mineral materials were sometimes used in ways that disrupted the path moisture would otherwise take. That barrier effect is underrated, because moisture damage is rarely uniform. It begins in pockets. A container wall sweats slightly. A humid draft enters one corner. A warm afternoon changes the top layer. A single contact point starts the failure. Powders can interrupt that process by reducing direct exposure and distributing dryness more evenly through the storage environment. The fourth mechanism is environmental stabilization through chemistry and texture. Different powders have different particle sizes, porosities, surface areas, and mineral properties. These influence how they interact with moisture. A fine porous material presents more surface area to the air. A mineral-rich substance may bind moisture differently than a plant-based powder. Ash clay, chalk-like dusts, and mineral compounds do not all behave the same, but many of them share one useful trait: they can alter how water moves, settles, or accumulates in a storage setting. That does not mean every old powder was equally safe or suitable for direct contact with food. It means the preservation logic was real. And this is where modern consumers often get misled. Today, people see silica gel packets, oxygen absorbers, anti-caking agents, sealed liners, and moisture-proof industrial packaging as high-tech solutions, but the underlying science is ancient. Reduce available moisture and the food lasts longer. Buffer humidity and spoilage slows down. Keep the environment dry, and dry food survives. The old powders were early tools built around the same principle. There is also a biological dimension. Mold bacterial growth, fermentation shifts, and pest activity often depend on available moisture. Dryness does not guarantee safety forever, but it makes life much harder for the organisms and conditions that destroy stored food. Once humidity rises, biological risk rises with it. That is why dry grains can remain stable for long periods under the right storage conditions, while the same grains can fail rapidly in damp air. Food preservation is not only about the food. It is about the air surrounding the food. It is about the container. It is about the wall, the shelf, the room, the season, and the invisible water content moving between all of them. That is why the powder mattered so much. It gave older storage systems a way to manage moisture without machines, electricity, or synthetic packaging. It did not make food immortal. It did not replace hygiene, proper drying, or good containers. But it strengthened all of them. It extended dryness. It defended texture. It protected shelf life by attacking the real problem early. So the old powder did not preserve food by stopping time. It preserved food by slowing moisture. And in the world of storage, that difference can mean months. Now we reach the part that makes the story uncomfortable, because cheap preservation methods rarely disappear just because they stop working. They disappear when a newer system becomes easier to sell, easier to standardize, and far more profitable to repeat at scale. That is exactly what happened with food storage. To be clear, this does not mean there was a dramatic conspiracy in which one industry secretly banned every traditional powder used to control moisture. Real suppression is usually quieter than that. It happens through incentives, regulation, convenience, branding, education, and consumer psychology. A simple method does not need to be outlawed to disappear. It only needs to become unfashionable, unbranded, and commercially inconvenient. And old powders were all three. Once modern packaging expanded, food preservation changed from a household skill into an industrial service. Factories no longer sold only food. They sold protection. They sold the container, the seal, the freshness promise, the visual cleanliness, the convenience, and the illusion that shelf life now came entirely from modern materials rather than from the ancient logic of moisture control. That shift changed everything. A traditional powder used to manage dryness is cheap, often local, sometimes reusable, sometimes nearly invisible in cost. It creates very little recurring revenue. A packaging system does the opposite. It can be patented, manufactured, branded, upgraded, regulated into standard forms, sold across every supply chain, and replaced endlessly. Once companies learned that preservation could be built into disposable packaging formats, the economics became obvious. The future would favor wrappers, sachets, sealed films, desiccant inserts, anti-moisture liners, and specialized containers, not because old drying principles stopped working, but because the new system could be monetized on a much larger scale. Then came the second force. Perception. Traditional powders looked messy. Modern packaging looked advanced. A bag with multiple layers printed branding moisture barriers and a factory seal appeared scientific. A natural powder ash-based layer clay method or simple desiccating material looked old, rural, and unreliable even when it was built on the exact same physical principle. Consumers began trusting sophistication they could see more than function they could not. That cultural shift mattered, because once people associate modern with safe, older methods, lose legitimacy almost instantly. They stop being viewed as technical solutions and start being treated as superstition, folklore, or poverty-era improvisation. Even when the science underneath remains valid, the image collapses. Then regulation strengthened the divide. Industrial food systems require standardization. Standardization favors materials that can be tested labeled mass-produced and inserted into predictable supply chains. Traditional drying powders were often too local, too variable, too dependent on correct handling, or too difficult to fit into universal commercial rules. A factory cannot easily build a global convenience brand around methods that require regional knowledge, careful judgment, and low-cost materials people might source themselves. So the market moved toward packaged certainty, and the public forgot what certainty used to be built on. Education followed the same path. Instead of teaching people that moisture is the real enemy and that preservation starts with controlling the surrounding environment, modern culture taught them to trust the product format. Buy the right container. Trust the factory seal. Keep the packet inside. Replace the packaging. Upgrade the storage system. The principle remained ancient, but the user was disconnected from it. That is how suppression really works. The science survives, the memory dies, and once the memory dies, industries no longer need to attack the old method directly. Consumers do the work for them. They stop asking whether a simpler solution exists. They stop seeing dryness as something they can manage. They begin treating preservation as a service available only through products. Meanwhile, the packaging economy grows larger. More products, more layers, more waste, more branded dependency. And fewer people remember that much of this system was built on one old truth: dry food survives when moisture is controlled early. That is why the powder faded from mainstream life. Not because it failed, but because modern packaging was better at turning an ancient principle into a scalable business. So how was this old powder actually used in practice, not as decoration? As environmental control. The most effective traditional use was never about throwing random powder directly onto food and hoping for preservation. It was about managing the storage space around the food so moisture had a harder time reaching it. That could mean placing a drying powder in separated layers, using it inside storage structures, but not mixed into the food itself, treating the surrounding container environment, or combining it with dry vessels, elevated storage, and repeated sun drying before sealing the contents away. That distinction matters, because the powder was part of a system. In practical terms, the method works best when 4 conditions are already respected. The food is properly dried. First, the storage container is clean and dry. The material used for moisture control is appropriate and safe for the intended use, and the surrounding space is protected from repeated humidity swings. Under those conditions, the powder acts as support. It helps preserve dryness. It does not replace good storage hygiene. This is especially useful for dry goods, such as grains, dried herbs, spices, seeds, powdered ingredients, tea, and salt-like materials that fail quickly once air moisture begins to accumulate. In low-resource settings, rural storage, emergency food holding, or places where packaging options are limited, simple moisture control methods can make an enormous difference. But there is an important warning. Not every traditional powder is food-safe for direct contact. Not every old method should be copied without care. The principle is useful. The application must be responsible. And that is exactly why this knowledge matters today. Because once people understand that shelf life depends on controlling moisture, early preservation stops looking like something only modern packaging can provide. So in the end, the real secret was never the powder alone. It was the forgotten understanding behind it. Long before modern packaging filled shelves with sealed layers, branded containers, and disposable preservation systems, people already knew the rule that mattered most: if dry food stays dry, it survives. And sometimes the simplest way to protect that dryness was not expensive technology, but an ordinary powder used with patience, skill, and environmental control. That is why this story matters. Because it reminds us that preservation did not begin in factories. It began in observation, in households, in trade routes, in storage rooms where people learned that moisture was the true enemy long before chemistry gave it modern labels. The powder was cheap, the principle was ancient, the science was real, and its disappearance was never proof of failure. Sometimes the most powerful knowledge is not destroyed. It is simply replaced by something easier to package, brand, and sell.